I'm Sue Curley, and I'm an engineer head at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. I have a college degree in electrical engineering, but I've spent most of the 23 years I've been here as a life support engineer, designing, testing, and building hardware to help keep astronauts alive both inside the vehicles and outside of the vehicles. Today we're going to talk about going outside of the vehicles with spacesuits. A spacesuit, for us, is a spacecraft for one. It has to do everything a space vehicle has to do, except it has to be mobile so you can wear it as well. What type of things does a spacesuit have to protect you from? Well, the very first thing is temperatures. Outside in space, it's both very cold and very hot, depending on where you are. The temperatures can range from minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, whether you're in the shade or in the sun. This can happen every 90 minutes if you're outside on a spacewalk in the space station. Also, a spacesuit has to provide oxygen. There's no air in space, and so in order to keep the human inside alive, we have to give them oxygen. Finally, your body needs pressure in order to keep you the shape that you are. Around this air right now, there's 14.7 pounds per square inch of air pressing on us here at sea level. In space, we're in a vacuum. There is no pressure on you. Your body needs about 3 psi in order to keep your shape. We use that in a spacesuit by providing air or oxygen through the entire suit to keep pressure on every part of your body. At about 4.3 is what we use to keep a little bit margin over what you need to stay safe. Also, a spacesuit protects you from the things that are flying around outside of you, outside micrometeors that are from broken meteoroids or space debris from ships that have either been taken apart or exploded while in space. And finally, if you're doing a spacewalk on a planetary body, you need some protection from the dust and the rocks on the surface that are very jagged and sharp and can cut you, and it needs to be durable to handle that. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about spacesuit history and how we got to where we are now from where we started. The early missions, the Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo missions, were not started out as doing spacewalk. The Gemini mission, the most important things were we were trying to see whether an astronaut could actually go into space, whether they would survive not having gravity and being out in space, and whether we could bring them back safely. So the spacesuit was actually meant for simply sitting inside your pressurized cockpit, unpressurized in the suit, in your cockpit, in the seated position, being able to reach your controls. These spacesuits were based off the flight suits used by high-altitude aircraft and naval aviators, and they were custom-made per astronaut. So they had one flight suit, a backup suit, and a training suit. These suits weighed about 23 to 27 pounds, and they were meant not to be pressurized. In case there was a problem with the cabin, that's when the suits would pressurize and they would get kind of bulky and inflated in their seats. These same type suits were used for the Mercury missions. However, this is when we did our first attempt at a spacewalk. 50 years ago, this year, was the first spacewalks of humans. Ed White, shown in the lower corner picture in the white background, was the first American spacewalker to go outside the vehicle on June 3rd, 1965, and he spent about 22 minutes outside his vehicle. So his spacesuit, although designed to be unpressurized, was meant to go outside for a little while in the pressurized environment. You can see that he's attached to the vehicle by an umbilical that's providing him his air through and attached to the space vehicle. So he couldn't go very far, but he got all of his services that he needed through that umbilical. Now, back in the early days, we just used air to help cool the astronauts while inside of their spacesuit. But we found out that that wasn't sufficient, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. When we got to the Apollo missions, the idea was to land on the moon and to go explore. And so you wanted to be able to go outside of the vehicle and move away for a while, as well as get into the rovers. So having an umbilical-based spacesuit wasn't very practical for a couple of reasons. One, you can't go any further than the cord that you're attached to. And also, if you've ever played with a hose and tried to blow air through it or had a fan at one end, the air at force at the beginning is much stronger than what you feel at the end. And so the further you go down the hose, the less air you get. That's not real practical for someone who's depending on it to live. So we developed what we call the portable life support system, which is the big backpack thing you see in the picture, to provide all of the services and also the autonomy to move away from the vehicle and to drive on the rovers. The portable life support system, or PLIS, is what we currently use today for spacesuits as well. Those spacesuits, though, were designed to go outside of the vehicle, and that's where they take on the big white bulky shape that you see used for spacewalks today. If you think about a balloon animal, the more air you pump into the balloon, the harder it is to bend it, and that's the case with a spacesuit. So when you see them walking and they look kind of inflated and stiff, it's because they're fighting that balloon, if you think of it that way. And we try not to pressurize it too much so that they can move against it, but we need it to be enough for them to have the pressure that they need on their body. That takes us to the current spacesuits. You'll see the orange spacesuit on the right was our launch, entry, and ascent spacesuit that was used in the shuttle days. If you've ever watched pictures of the astronauts getting on the shuttle, when they'd walk out to go to the shuttle, you'd see them in the orange suits. Those launch and entry suits were much like the early Gemini and Mercury suits. They were designed for unpressurized use while sitting in the cabin, while riding up to space, and for coming back, to help protect astronauts in the event something happened to the vehicle and they needed to either be carried off, or if there was a cabin depressurization in the vehicle, the spacesuits would pressurize and keep them safe inside, or help to keep them safe. These were not meant for the spacewalking suits. The spacewalking suits are what you see on the other side of the picture, which is our traditional white-looking extravehicular activity suits, or what we call our EMU. Now, we haven't used the orange suits since the shuttle days, but these are making a comeback with the new Orion vehicle. You will see those as the vehicle, the spacesuit of choice for that vehicle as we move through the Orion program. And they need those inside the capsule to protect them for the same reasons they did in the shuttle and the early Gemini and Mercury days. Let's talk more about the white spacesuit. That's our extravehicular mobility unit, the same spacesuit that you see astronauts using if you watch on the NASA channel today. It's the same suit that was designed in the 1980s, and we've been using them ever since. They have been upgraded since then, but those are the same spacesuits. These were designed for pressurized use outside of the vehicle, so we tried to optimize them to make them easier for astronauts to use while being blown up like a balloon. And so they have some things in them to help move their arms and their wrists, what we call mobility agents, to help them not have to work so hard against the balloon of the spacesuit. These suits, unlike the early suits that were just flight suits and weighed 20 to 30 pounds, when they have all of the systems in the backpack charged, they can weigh up to 313 pounds. In space, they don't weigh anything, but it makes it very difficult here on Earth. And also, while they're in the space station, these suits, unlike the flight suits, you need some assistance to get into. So we'll talk about the parts of it, and I'll talk about how that works. First, back in the Apollo days, we used air to cool the astronauts, but we found out that wasn't enough, and their visors would fog up, and it made it very difficult for them to work when their helmet was down. So we went to what we call our liquid cooling garment. This is what we call the pajamas that they wear inside the spacesuit, and if you'll note, it has a lot of tiny little tubes throughout the whole garment. This plugs into the portable life support system, and cool water flows through it. There's a dial on the front of the spacesuit that allows the astronauts to adjust the amount of cooling. In space, you don't need to heat yourself too much. You're more worried about cooling. If you ever have worn lots of clothes or had to be out in the snow, playing in the snow, when you start working, you tend to get hot. You get to take your layers off. In space, they can't do that. So we use the liquid cooling garment to help keep them cool. There's no parts of the spacesuit that are actively heated, with a caveat of the gloves. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But all we worry about is the cooling. That's the inside layer of the spacesuit. In order for the astronauts to be able to communicate with each other and with the space vehicle, they wear what we call our Common Communications Assembly, or CCA. It's anecdotally known as the Snoopy cap. If you watch the Snoopy cartoons and you see him as the Red Baron, this is the shape of the helmet that he wears. It has speakers on each side for the ears, and it would also have 2 microphones for the astronauts to be able to talk to each other and the space vehicle. That's what they wear underneath their spacesuits. The spacesuit itself is made up of a couple pieces. Unlike the flight suits, which is a suit that you zipped up, the extravehicular mobility unit comes in about 2 pieces. So you have the main upper portion, which has a hard surface underneath. You can see in the top middle of this picture, it's called the hard upper torso, and it's made out of fiberglass. This does 2 things. One, it helps provide a rigid structure to support the weight of the portable life support system and all of the rest of the suit features. It kind of is the anchor that everything ties to. As well, it protects the human's most important parts from micrometeor debris and abrasions that can be outside of the space vehicle environment. Then we have the top part of that, and then you put your pants on the bottom part. Now, in the early days of the flight suits, all of those suits were custom made. But when we started moving into the shuttle era, we were going to do a lot of spacewalks to build the space station. Building 1 spacesuit per astronaut was cost prohibitive. So we transitioned to a system much like the clothes you wear, where the shirt, if you will, and the pants come in small, medium, large, and extra large. And we can change those out depending on which astronaut's going to be doing an EVA. So if you have a guy with broad shoulders and a slim waist, he might wear an extra large hut and medium-sized pants. And so we can change those out in between spacewalks. Now, because the systems are bulky, in the space station, if you watch them getting ready for an EVA, the hard upper torso is already mated to the portable life support system, and that's attached to the space station. The astronauts have to crawl underneath it and put their arms in, and they basically hang from the wall of the space station where their buddy helps get their pants on. And so they get attached together on the wall. It's at least a 2-person effort to do that. We found that that strange movement of climbing in has caused some shoulder injury problems with our with our astronauts, and so that's something as we work on the new spacesuits we're working to fix. We don't want to hurt someone before they go on a spacewalk, or at all, actually. And also, having 2 people required to put a spacesuit on takes a lot of time. And as we go forward to exploring the moon and Mars again, we need to shorten the amount of time it takes to get ready so that we can use that time for spacewalks. A spacesuit is used between 6.5 and 8 hours at a time for a spacewalk. There's enough consumables in it for up to 8 hours. Plus, having a half an hour in the event of emergency, a secondary system will kick in and allow you 30 minutes to get back to a safe haven. So you don't want to use extra time spent working against the spacesuit. We need to design something that's a little bit more user-friendly. Also, we need the other guy, once you're off on far planets, to be able to do something else instead of spending time helping his buddy. When we talk a little bit about future spacesuits, you'll see how we're working to design against that. So we have the hard upper torso and the pants. Now let's talk about how the spacesuit works a little bit. So inside they wear comfort clothes, kind of like if you're working outside, you might wear a t-shirt underneath your regular clothes to help collect sweat and stuff. Well, astronauts do that too. Although this has chiffon on the inside, it can tend to stick to you if you get really sweaty. So they usually wear a soft layer of clothing underneath their liquid cooling garment. Then the next layer of the spacesuit, I'll show you by this glove. This is the pressurized bladder. This is the balloon that holds the air pressure inside the spacesuit. Every segment of the spacesuit has this in it, and you can see at the top here is where it joins to the pieces, so the pieces of the spacesuit can be attached together. This is the balloon. The next layer of the spacesuit is called the restraint layer. The restraint layer helps protect the balloon layer from overpressurizing. Basically, it keeps its shape. In the case of the glove, this is a very special restraint layer. In microgravity, where there is no gravity, you don't use the lower half of your body. It pretty much just hangs out with you. You might use it for clipping on and stabilizing yourself at your workspace, but mostly it's useless. You can tell that by the bottom of the boot. If you notice, unlike your shoes, it has no treads. It's not needed for gripping. We talked a little bit about body stability. We do have clips on the boot that allow you to snap into our portable foot restraint to help keep you from moving around too much if you're out at a work site doing some work and moving big bulky things around. You can see the astronauts doing this when they're outside the space station on the large robotic arm. They will be clipped into the foot restraint. But all of the work that an astronaut does in microgravity, they do with their hands. Their hands are essentially like their feet. They do all of their walking to translate to their workspace. They move the equipment around, and then they do all of the actual work with their hands. So their hands are very important. So we have this special restraint layer for the glove. And you can see there are tiny little strings on each of the fingers. These tie like shoelaces to help tie the balloon layer as tightly as possible around the fingers to make sure that they have the dexterity they need to use their hands. Think about a balloon again for a second. The more air it is, the harder it is to bend. Astronauts are constantly having to work against the spacesuit that wants to keep their fingers out straight. The closer we can get the suit to their fingers, the easier this is for them to use. We also built some mobility agents into the gloves themselves to help them bend at the wrist joints where you naturally bend, to give them some assistance against the balloon while they're working. The final layer of a spacesuit is what we call the cover layer. This is the thermal micrometeor garment, or TMG. It covers the entire spacesuit, and it's made up of a bunch of layers of fabric. And what it does is a few different things. One, it protects against the temperature extremes. This is what keeps you from getting too cold or too hot. It also has Kevlar and Nomex and Gore-Tex in it that help with strength and micrometeor debris impact type resistance. So that helps keep you from breaking holes in your pressure garment as well. For the gloves, you can see this has the treads. These are their feet in space. And so we have a grip material to help them be able to latch onto their equipment as well as go across where they need to for the space vehicles to get to their work sites. I mentioned that we don't actively or heat anything in the spacesuit. The gloves are the only exception. In space, all the blood volume of your body floats up to the middle point of your body because there's no gravity pulling it down to your extremities. So your hands and feet can get really cold without the blood circulating through them. So since your hands are the most important, we have found that astronauts have complained and had problems with losing feeling in the ends of their fingers. So we actually take heaters at the top of each fingernail and we heat the astronaut's hand. It runs through a battery pack that comes out of their glove, and they can turn it on and off as they need to warm up their hands to help them. This cover layer is over the entire suit, including the portable life support system to help give it structure. Now, when you're in space, it's kind of, think about a car ride. Sometimes you go on car rides and you don't take any rest stops or stop to eat, right? You're just trying to get where you're going. Well, we don't feed our astronauts when they go out on a spacewalk currently. We have tried using some food nutrition bars, but those tend to get really messy. And you also have to consider that it just kind of hangs out in the helmet. You can't reach in to get to your mouth when you have a helmet on. So it sort of sits there and it got crumbs and sloppy. And that isn't a system that's working for us. So we don't feed our astronauts while they're on a spacewalk. We do, however, provide them with something to drink. This is a drink bag, and it's mounted underneath the hard upper torso. The valve comes through the helmet, and they can use their sippy cup as they need to while they're out on a spacewalk. This holds 32 ounces of water. We've talked about using sports drinks and something else to help astronauts with electrolytes while they're out. However, these launch much earlier than a spacewalk, and they have to be able to sit on a shelf for a long time. And we found that the sugars in the sports drink are not shelf stable and will actually grow mold and stuff before they're used. So currently, we only use water. However, we are looking at other things to be able to put in these bags for when we go to Mars and we need our astronauts to go out and do some heavy work on the surface. What comes in must go out. There are no rest stops on a spacewalk. So yes, astronauts wear diapers. However, diaper is not a flattering term for an adult. So here at NASA we call this our maximum absorbency garment, or the MAG. Astronauts put these on and wear them while they're out on a spacewalk. They also wear them when they launch and when they return inside those orange spacesuits as well. And after their spacewalk, they toss them in the garbage, just like you would. In order to use the spacesuit, there's a module on the front called the Display and Control Module. This functions a lot like the dashboard in your car, and it has a little display to be able to show the astronaut how the suit systems are. So say, if you think about it like your car, how much gas you have left, what your tire pressure is, if you have any alarms. It also allows them to control the communications assembly between themselves to their fellow or to the vehicle. It allows them to turn the fans on and off in the portable life support system. It allows them to adjust their cooling as well as adjust the pressures. Currently, we don't adjust pressure while out on a spacewalk. We do that while the astronauts are still inside the space vehicle before they go out. They do very minimal controls on the outside of the spacesuit once they go out. But in the future, when we talk about working on a surface, we want to minimize the time it takes an astronaut to be able to go outside. Well, if the space vehicle is at 14.7 or 10.2 psi, it takes a while for them to get down to the spacesuit pressure of about 4.3. Part of that is because the atmosphere in the space vehicle is much like the atmosphere in the room. The air contains nitrogen. Once you go into lower pressures, you have the potential for, like if you do scuba diving, to get what are known as the bends. That's the nitrogen bubbling out of the blood, and it's very painful, and it can actually cause injury or death. And we preclude that by having the astronauts breathe 100% oxygen prior to going out, and we step them down through pressures in preparation for a spacewalk. And that takes hours. They camp out in the airlock now to do that. Well, if you want to be able to go explore the surface of Mars, we need to reduce the amount of time it takes astronauts to get ready. So we're working towards making spacesuits that operate at a higher pressure to go out the door, and then you can adjust the pressure as you're going out on your spacewalk and gathering your tools and getting ready to do the hard work to be able to turn it down. So it's called a walking pre-breathe, and you're getting your body ready for your spacewalk while you're already going out and getting your work site ready. And these are some of the things we're working on for our future spacesuits. Spacesuits have a challenge. We talked in microgravity that you don't really need your legs, but that's very different when you go to the surface of a planet. Currently, the spacesuit pants are just the balloon type thing. They don't have any mobility agents like we have in the upper portion of the spacesuit. Here's some video of astronaut Charles Duke during an Apollo mission on the moon. Pay careful attention to the effort he has to put in working against his spacesuit. Also note how dirty this spacesuit is. That plays a role in future exploration as well. So guys, I don't know, can I get this to play? Can you guys see the video? Because it's not playing for me here. But...
Yeah, it is.
You'll have to let me know when it finishes. So as you can see, Mr. Duke had to work very hard against the spacesuit. He tried hard too, gave one giant leap there towards the end. But if you saw how far his hand was from the actual hammer, then you can see some of the challenges we have with overcoming the pressure and the pants of the spacesuit. Fortunately for Mr. Duke, there was what we call the space trash picker-upper in the rover. So he went back to the rover and got his trash picker and was able to pick up the hammer. But these are some of the things we need to think about when designing spacesuits for future surface activities that spend a lot of resources both in the consumables. His MET rate went up. He was breathing harder and working harder, which takes away from what he has in his backpack. And also there was a lot of time spent fighting both the hammer and then having to try to spend all that time picking up, then going back to the rover. When you have a limited amount of spacewalk time, you want it to be as productive as possible. So these videos became very important for us engineers here on the ground when looking forward to what the next spacesuits needed to do. This is a prototype spacesuit for our next exploration. You'll see a few different things with this. One of the most important things I want to show you is on the far right of the screen. You'll see that the entry for the spacesuit is now in the rear instead of in two pieces like we talked about on the space station. This allows for the astronaut to get into the spacesuit by themselves and get out. The spacesuit can hang and have a bar above it. You slide in and then pull yourself out. So now we have single person donning and doffing of the spacesuit. Also, you can see by the middle of the picture, we've put some mobility aids into the lower portion of the spacesuit in order to allow the astronauts to be able to bend down both at the waist and the hips. There are bearings now in the hip and in the upper thigh to allow them to be able to lift their legs and walk more easily and bend down. This suit is used extensively on the ground for testing and preparation for our future spacesuits. You can see some pictures here. We have them out in the rock yard in Arizona and New Mexico where we practice spacewalks using both the tools and the suits for future exploration. This rear entry suit used the idea of a soft brief, if you will, a soft short area, to see if we could even improve mobility with a soft type garment, but provide the protection that the astronauts need in the event they fall down. What we ended up with, you'll see on the picture on the right-hand side, looks like a very popular Space Ranger. This is Time Magazine's Invention of the Year in 2012, and this cover layer is what you see as far as the colors are concerned. My understanding is that the color choice was just an accident. However, NASA received so much publicity from it, the picture on the right shows you the next evolution of the cover layer that we actually crowdsourced. We put out several designs on the internet and we had the American public vote on it. And this was the choice for the cover layer for the next spacesuit. That suit will be delivered by the end of the year and we'll be using it in the first human in vacuum testing in over 30 years, starting early next year in 2016. This suit uses a combination of a soft and hard brief. It sort of has like an underwear portion that is hard in the event that an astronaut falls down. That way they don't have any impact, or they have some impact protection on their bottom. But then there's a soft portion in the upper part of their thigh and the remainder of the legs, allow them to as much flexibility for movement. We do have bearings in the hips and the upper thigh and the ankle, and we're using a hiking style boot for the surface. It needs to have the heavy duty tread in order to protect the feet while walking on the surface of a planet. You'll see it looks more like clothing in the upper portion too. It does have a hard upper torso that's made out of a composite material which is lighter than the fiberglass, but because it's a rear entry suit, it now has just a material portion in the waist that allows the astronauts to bend and turn much more naturally, which would help